O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both, mine other self.
In Lanedell, the royal capital, seat of the Golden Order and heart of the lands between, there stands a statue of the red-haired champion Radagon. It is a monument to his divinity, his authority, his permanence. But those who kneel before it and speak the law of regression will find something carved beneath the surface of that divinity, a message. Radagon is Marika. Few cast a longer shadow over the recent history of the lands between than Radagon of the Golden Order. His wars shaped borders. His faith built doctrine. His teachings and his conquests forming the very bedrock of the world as we know it, for all its glories and its sorrows. Yet to see him as a simple, unwavering champion is to miss the bewildering truth of his nature. He is not the simple champion his monuments suggest. The image of Radagon as a faithful servant of the greater will is one the Order was happy to let stand, but the truth of what he was, what he struggled with, and what he ultimately became is far more complicated, and in a way, more human. So rest beside me a while, and let me tell you about Radagon, the Queen's consort, the second Elden Lord, and the champion of the Golden Order. The great enigma of Radagon begins with his abrupt arrival in the annals of history. Before the wars of Liurnia, the records are silent. He simply does not exist. Then, suddenly, he appears, already a commander of immense prestige, already a champion and a warlord. A memory from those days, preserved within the barrier of gold incantation, offers our first glimpse of him. This incantation was used by the champions of the Erdtree in the First and Second Liurnian Wars, during which the red-haired Radagon joined the heroes' ranks. He emerged at the head of the Erdtree's armies during their brutal campaigns to subdue the Carian royal family. This was no small task. The sorcerers of Raya Lucaria were masters of their craft, and their knights were formidable opponents who stood against the might of Lanedell with fierce determination. An inscription on the Carian knight's sword speaks to their strength. These knights' swords could serve as catalysts, letting them wield sorcerous battle skills. Despite numbering fewer than 20, this power made them a match for even the champions of gold in battle. Yet, this previously unknown hero, the red-haired Radagon, led these champions of gold. How could a man with no recorded past or lineage be granted command of the Golden Host in such a pivotal conflict? This question naturally leads to the much larger one, a query famously posed by Pastor Muriel: who truly is Radagon? Among scholars and scribes, two dominant schools of thought have long tried to answer this. One interpretation suggests Radagon was once a distinct individual, a mortal man who rose from obscurity. Some tales in this vein even claim he was a common laborer, perhaps descended from the giants, pointing to his fiery hair as evidence of that ancient bloodline. It is a straightforward account of a hero's ascent. The other path of inquiry, however, leads to a more disquieting conclusion. This view contends that Radagon was never a singular person at all, at least not in the way we understand it. For as long as he has been known to the world, he has been intrinsically linked to another. Both interpretations have their merits and are worthy of consideration. And yet some evidence is hard to ignore. The foundational secret at the heart of the Golden Order, the revelation that recontextualizes an entire era, is this: Queen Marika the Eternal and the second Elden Lord, Radagon, are the same being. They are not merely husband and wife, but something more than that in a contradicted way. Two sides of a single entity. The implications of this are indeed staggering, for it means that the history of their time was guided not by a royal couple, but by the complex and perhaps conflicted desires of one divine being. To know Radagon is to know Marika, and to understand their duality is to begin to understand the fate of the Elden Ring. Let us now turn our attention to the first and most straightforward theory concerning Radagon's origins, that he was once a man of flesh and blood, a separate being who, by some unknown means, was later joined with Queen Marika. The key to this interpretation lies with a most unusual object, a crude weapon forged from a common stone brick. The story etched into this brick hammer is as follows. Weapon made from an ordinary stone brick, wielded by a laborer who led a rebellion, and later became a champion himself. Even among other bludgeons of its size, this weapon is especially weighty. The strength of a giant is required to wield it. It is easy to see why some would connect this simple description to the great Radagon. The mention of a champion, the connection to a hammer, and the reference to a giant's power all seem to point toward him. After all, it is well known that Radagon was called a great champion during the Liurnian campaigns. And a hammer is the weapon he wields in the end, the very same one his other half, Marika, once used to shatter the Elden Ring. From these threads, a plausible history may take shape. This tale suggests that Radagon began life not as a hero, but as a laborer, perhaps one of the rugged folk from the north. A description of the northerners says they are a face found among the hard people of the unforgiving north. Some say they are descended from giants. This could explain the immense strength needed to wield the brick hammer. His lineage might have been marked not only by his might, but also by his vibrant red hair, a feature he shared with the fire giants. The description of the giant's red braid tells that Radagon came to despise his own hair. It is not difficult to imagine why. His hair was a constant link to the ancient enemies of the Erdtree, a mark of heritage that could have brought him shame and mistreatment in a society that reviled the giants. If he were a laborer in Stormvale, a fortress built by the very people who defeated his ancestors, it would stand to reason that his giant-like features would make him a target of scorn. The weapon's memory goes further, telling of a rebellion led by this very laborer. Perhaps this Radagon, pushed to his limit, rose up against his oppressors, and for his courage, he was not crushed, but instead recognized and elevated to the status of a champion. It is an appealing story of a man rising from nothing. However, a closer look at this account reveals certain weaknesses. While the narrative of the rebellious laborer is a powerful one, it stands on unsteady ground. The conclusion that Radagon was never a separate person remains the more convincing one, that he is, and always has been, the male aspect of Marika, a being brought into existence when she became the vessel for the Great Rune. Furthermore, the reference to the strength of a giant may not point to Radagon's ancestry at all. Instead, it could be a reference to a bygone era. A similar phrase appears on the Giant Crusher, which says, "After the giants were felled, and man turned against man in violence, this weapon was all but forgotten. Man has grown feeble in comparison to his forebears." It is entirely possible the brick hammer's tale is not of Radagon, but of an unrelated hero from Godfrey's age, a time when all people were simply stronger than they are today. Lastly, there is the matter of where the hammer was found, Stormvale Castle, a place with no known connection to Radagon's life or campaigns. These points of doubt lend significant weight to the primary thesis of this chronicle, that Radagon was born of Marika's own soul, a consequence of her bond with the Elden Ring. And it is important to note that even if one were to accept the story of the laborer, the timeline of events would still place his fusion with Marika before he ever marched on Liurnia and met Rennala. The reasoning for this will become clear as this tale continues. And yet, it would be unfair to dismiss the theory of Radagon as a man of giant descent too quickly. For whatever its weaknesses, it does not lack for interesting narratives. Many scholars of the Golden Lineage dismiss the theory of Radagon being connected to the fire giants. They see flaws in the account, yet it remains a compelling way to answer certain questions that have long troubled historians. It is difficult to ignore the description found on the giant's red braid, which states, "Every giant is red of hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps that was a curse of their kind." While this does not explicitly state he was one of them, it establishes a notable link. It tells us that Radagon was aware of the giant's traits, and that his hair was not merely a coincidence. His hatred for it may have been a rejection of that very heritage. He knew what his hair meant. He knew what it recalled, and he hated it for exactly that reason. That is not the reaction of a man who simply happens to share a hair color with an ancient enemy. That is the reaction of someone who understood the weight of what he carried on his own head and wanted nothing to do with it. There is one more matter that gives this account more weight: the demigod son of Radagon, General Radon. Radon is not merely large. He is enormous, far beyond what any ordinary man should be. This has always been a puzzle, as the thrones and chambers of Leyndell were made for men of normal proportions. If we consider the possibility that Radagon was a kin of the giants, it would serve as a direct explanation for how his son could possess such a colossal frame. It would be a matter of his inherited bloodline. None of this confirms the theory, but it gives it a pulse, and that is enough to keep it worth considering. However, we must confront the evidence that Radagon is the other half of Queen Marika herself. This truth makes the giant bloodline theory difficult to reconcile. And yet, I personally believe that Radagon has a grave and significant connection to the giants. The lore implies it too strongly for us to simply ignore it. We must find room for the giants in his story. Whether Radagon carried giant blood in a literal sense, or whether the giants simply left some deeper mark on what he was, the lore leaves more room for them in his story than it is sometimes given credit for. But even with that, it is as clear as day that Marika and Radagon are one and the same, even if they are different. Different in nature, different in what they wanted and what they believed, and yet inseparable at the root. That is the fact the lands between built itself around, whether it knew so or not. Another point of consideration is that this duality is not entirely unique to Radagon and Marika. A comparable pattern of a twofold existence can be observed in their son, the Imperian Mikilla. Like his mother, Mikilla was chosen as a candidate for godhood, and this status appears to come with its own unique complexities of being. Mikilla, the boy cursed with eternal youth, is known to have a second aspect, the figure known as Saint Trina. While Mikilla is a public figure associated with the Erdtree and the unalloyed gold, Saint Trina is a more enigmatic presence, connected to sleep, dreams, and forgotten rites. Yet, lore and artifact alike treat them not as separate individuals, but as two facets of a single person. This curious case suggests that the capacity for such a division may be an inherent trait of Imperians. If Mikilla can exist as both himself and Saint Trina, it lends enormous credibility to the idea that Marika could do the same with Radagon. Furthermore, the lore of Saint Trina shows that this second self could possess a distinct identity, enough to be revered and followed as a separate entity. This provides a perfect model for how Radagon could have acted with his own will in the world, leading the armies of the Golden Order and even wedding the Carrion Queen, all while being fundamentally a part of Marika. The separation, it would seem, need not be a physical one, but a division of persona and purpose, allowing one being to be in two places and be two people at once. And yet, even though it is stated and hinted many times that they are one being, it is never answered when or how they became so. When did Radagon become part of Marika? Was he always there, present from her very first breath as a god? And if so, how does one account for what followed? How did he march against the Carians in her name while she sat as queen? How did he wed Renala while, at the same time, Marika was wed to Godfrey? These are questions so difficult to even articulate due to their sheer complexity. So let us go back, as far back as the record allows, to the moment Marika became a god. We know from accounts of the land of shadow that there exists a gate of divinity. It is the threshold through which an Imperian must pass to become a god. But the gate does not open for an Imperian alone. Another condition must be met. A consort must exist beside the one who would ascend. This is not a tradition or a preference. It is a condition, fixed and firm. We see this with the unalloyed Mikilla, who intended for his half-brother Radagon to be his lord consort. From this, we can deduce that this is a non-negotiable requirement, which brings the question directly to Marika, who was her consort at the moment of her ascension. When she stood before that threshold, who stood beside her? We can't know for sure, as there is as little information of that period as it can get. But if we theorize that Radagon was manifested at that time, it would answer the very puzzling question of who Mesmer's father is. It is never explicitly stated that he is the son of Radagon, but the signature of the red hair is present. If we accept the idea of Radagon being by her side at that time, it would fill many gaps in the record. However, it is worth noting that Mikilla's situation is a bit different than Marika's. Mikilla had abandoned St. Trina, and with that, perhaps he lost the default eligibility to ascend. An Imperian without their other self is, in some sense, incomplete. This may have created the need for a physically manifested consort. If so, then Marika could have ascended alone without Radagon as a separate entity, because perhaps at that time she had not yet departed from her other self. In any case, Radagon must have had some form of existence prior to that ascension. If Radagon only came into existence after Marika crossed the threshold of godhood, then the requirement of a consort for that very ascension has no answer. The condition demands someone beside her before she becomes a god, not after. A being born from her ascension could not also be the one who made it possible. Things only begin to make sense when we treat Radagon and Marika as two aspects of a single divine nature. She is the female face of that nature. He is the male face, and this duality is not something that happened to them. It is what they are. And if this quality belongs to Imperians by nature, then it was present in Marika long before she ever stood at the gate of divinity. But this is where Ranni enters the picture and complicates things. Ranni is an Imperian, and yet there is no second self beside her, no other aspect that she carries or once carried, none that the record preserves in any case. If the duality of Marika and Radagon is a quality native to all Imperians, then Ranni stands as an exception that the theory cannot easily account for. And then there is the deeper question of what makes an Imperian in the first place. Is it a title given by the two fingers a designation rather than a nature? Or does it come from being born of a single divine being? If it is the latter, then Ranni's standing as an Imperian becomes its own puzzle, because her mother is Renala, a mortal queen of Raya Lucaria, and her father, by most accounts, is Radagon. She was not born of one god, unless Radagon and Marika are truly the same being. In that case, Ranni was born of Renala and of Marika, in the form Marika wore when she walked as Radagon. And if Marika is a god, then Ranni's divine parentage is accounted for. Her Imperian nature follows. But then, why is Radagon not an Imperian? He is Ranni's full-blooded brother. He too was born of Radagon, which by this logic would make Marika his parent as well. He was called the mightiest demigod of the age, and yet Imperian is not a title that was ever given to him. This enigma, it seems, only leads to circles. Every answer opens a new door that leads to another unanswered room. Ranni's case alone is enough to show that the nature of Imperians is not something the record explains in full, and perhaps was never meant to be explained cleanly. And yet, even with Ranni standing as an unresolved thread, the account of Radagon as an inseparable part of Marika from the very beginning remains the most coherent one available. It stands stronger than the proposition that they were two separate beings who conjoined later, because it answers more than it leaves open, which is more than can be said for the alternative. What that alternative looks like and why it falls short is a matter we shall speak of next. Of all the reasons to doubt that Radagon ever existed as his own separate person, the simplest one is also the most telling. He appears from nowhere in the timeline. There is no record of him before the Liurnian Wars. No mention of his name in the ranks of the Erdtree's faithful. No account of how he earned his standing, what office he held, who recognized him, or what he did to be trusted with command. He is not introduced gradually. He does not surface in older records as a minor figure who slowly rose to prominence. The history of the lands between simply does not contain him, and then one day it does, and he is already at the head of the army. Muriel tells us this plainly. Radagon led the forces of Leyndell. He was at the front of the Golden Order's host during one of the most significant military campaigns in recent memory. That is not a small position. That is not something a man arrives at without a past. A commander of that standing would leave traces. His name would appear somewhere before the moment he is suddenly in charge of an entire war. Someone would have noted him. Some record, some inscription, some whispered account preserved in the memory of a weapon, or the description of an old incantation would have placed him earlier in the timeline. And yet, there is nothing. And that absence is not a gap in the record. Gaps in records have a texture to them. There are usually threads that lead toward the missing piece, hints that something existed before it was lost. This historical vacuum is perhaps the most compelling evidence of all. Men have histories. They have a youth, a period of rising, and a path to greatness. Radagon has none of these things. He simply is. Such an immediate and unearned prominence strongly suggests he was not a man who rose through the ranks. A man does not simply materialize at the head of an army with no history and no explanation, but an aspect of a god, called forward when the moment required it, arriving fully formed because it was never truly absent to begin with. That is a different matter entirely. Furthermore, one must question the political logic of Radagon's rise. Why was he, specifically, chosen to represent the Golden Order? If he were just a common champion, no matter how skilled, how does his marriage to Renala of the Carian royals truly join their two houses? A union's power is in the joining of bloodlines, of lineage. To understand why this marriage is so revealing, one must first understand what it was for. The Second Liurnian War did not end in triumph for either side. The sword monument marks it plainly. The Second Liurnian War. No victory for the Golden, nor for the Moon. No prize but atonement. The birth of a vow. Leyndell could not break through. The Carian forces, bolstered by the sorcery of Raya Lucaria, held their ground. Neither army could claim the field. And so instead of a victor, there was a union. Muriel describes what followed.
Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Renala. The order of the Erdtree and the fate of the moon were conjoined, and all the wounds of war forgiven.
A marriage that joins two royal houses is not a casual arrangement. It is a political act of the highest order. It binds bloodlines, legitimizes claims, and seals the peace between powers that could not defeat each other on the battlefield. For such a marriage to carry that weight, the person being offered must carry equivalent weight. Renala was a queen, the head of the royal house of Caria. A union between a queen and a soldier does not join two kingdoms. For the union to mean anything, the one she was joined to had to represent something of equal standing on the other side. So what standing did Radagon have? He arrived at the head of Leyndell's army with no recorded past, no lineage, no title that the record names, no explanation of how he came to hold the authority he clearly held. And yet his marriage to Renala is treated as sufficient to bind the two royal houses together. That is an enormous amount of political and symbolic weight to rest on a man whose origins no one can account for. The most straightforward answer is that Radagon carried that weight because he was Marika, the most royal blood in the lands between, present in a form the world could see and interact with, conducting affairs that Marika herself could not conduct while seated on her throne. One might speculate that a convenient story was created for him, that he was presented as a minor royal or a distant relative to Queen Marika to give the marriage legitimacy. But such a fiction would still require some foundation, some record or title to make it believable. Yet, as we have established, no such record exists. He has no past, no family name, and no connection to the royal lineage is ever mentioned. The truth, then, must be more fundamental. Radagon did not need to be presented as a member of the royal family because he was, in fact, the embodiment of its highest power. His blood was the most royal of all, for it was Marika's own. The marriage held absolute authority because it was a union between Queen Rennala and Marika the Eternal, with Radagon serving as the Queen's other self. This is the only explanation that satisfies the political reality of the event. It was not a champion who wed the Carrion Queen. It was a god. But this must not be taken to mean that Radagon and Marika were the same mind, or the same will, or the same person in any way that the word person usually implies. The evidence pushes firmly against that reading. Rennala loved Radagon. That much is clear in how she is written, in what she held until long after he was gone, in the grief that hollowed her out when he left. And yet toward Marika, what is hinted at is something far colder. Not love, perhaps the opposite of it. That a woman could love one and resent the other, while the two were housed in the same being, tells us something important. Radagon was not Marika wearing a different face. He was his own presence, his own character, shaped differently from her in ways that mattered to the people around him. And then there is what Marika herself said. Melina carries her words, spoken in the bedchamber, and they are worth sitting with carefully.
O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both, mine other self.
Some have taken this as proof that Radagon and Marika were once fully separate beings who later came together, pointing to the line,
Thou art yet to become me,
as evidence of a merging that had not yet been completed. That reading is understandable. The words do carry that possibility on their surface, but it is not the only way to hear them, and it is not the most fitting one. What Marika calls him in the same breath is mine other self. Not a stranger she absorbed, not a man she consumed. Her other self. And what she is urging is not a first merging, but a deeper one. A surrender of the distance that had grown between two aspects of the same being. She is not asking Radagon to become her for the first time. She is asking him to stop holding himself apart from what he already is. What this speech confirms, beyond any argument, is that Radagon and Marika were two distinct minds. Two characters with their own desires, their own directions, their own ways of moving through the world. That is not in question. But two minds can share one origin. Two characters can be aspects of something that was never truly divided to begin with. And that is what Marika's own words point toward, not a union yet to happen, but a return to a wholeness that had been quietly slipping away. There is another piece of evidence that leads one to believe he was part of Marika, even at the time of his marriage to Rennala. And this is the amber egg. When Radagon left Rennala, he did not leave her with nothing. He left her with the amber egg. Muriel speaks to this directly.
In the end, Lady Rennala was left alone, cradling the amber egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her.
And what is the amber egg? The description of the great rune of the unborn answers that. Amber egg clutched by Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, great rune of unborn demigods. This amber egg is no mere trinket. It is a great rune from the Elden Ring itself. Renala's ownership of this rune has long been a point of speculations. Every other great rune carries the name of the demigod who holds it. Godric's great rune, Morgoth's great rune, Melania's great rune. But the rune Renala holds is named for the unborn. It is the only great rune not named for the demigod who carries it, but for its function. She did not inherit it through divine right. She did not earn it through her own power. It was given to her, and the one who gave it was Radagon. This is where the question becomes impossible to ignore. How does a champion, a warlord of uncertain origin and no recorded lineage, come to possess a fragment of the Elden Ring? To offer a great rune as a gift requires the ability to access and handle the very essence of the Golden Order. There is only one being in all the lands between known to possess such absolute authority over the Elden Ring: Queen Marika the Eternal. She is its vessel, the one who later proved she could shatter it, and had previously removed the rune of death from its hole. If Radagon were merely a champion, even the greatest champion in the land, how could he possibly acquire a piece of the Elden Ring to leave as a parting keepsake? Such an act would be beyond the capabilities of any mortal man. However, if Radagon was and always had been the other self of Marika, the puzzle is immediately solved. The gift would have come not from a soldier, but from the god who housed the object itself. It would explain how a piece of the foundational power of the world could be given in an act of personal farewell. The most pointed doubts about Radagon's origins were raised by Pastor Muriel himself, who did not merely chronicle history, but questioned it. His words directly challenge the official narrative.
The mystery endures to this day as to why Lord Radagon would cast Lady Renala aside, and moreover, why a mere champion would be chosen for the seat of Elden Lord.
Out of all the nobles and heroes in the lands between, why would Marika choose this champion of mysterious origin for her consort, especially one already bound by a politically significant marriage? In the same breath, Muriel illuminates the path to the answer by speaking of a great secret. He tells a tale.
You know, it's said that Lord Radagon harbored a secret. A famed sculptor of the Erdtree capital was once summoned to render Lord Radagon's likeness in giant stature, when he glimpsed the skeleton in Radagon's closet. And as such, it's said the great statue harbors his secret too.
This is a direct reference to the great statue in Leyndell, a marvel of artistry that, through a simple prayer, can shift its form, transforming the image of Radagon into that of Queen Marika. The sculptor saw not one being, but two. This, then, is the skeleton in the closet, the secret Radagon harbored. The pastor links the question of Radagon's improbable rise directly to the secret of his dual nature. The reason a mere champion was chosen to be Elden Lord is because he was already the queen. This obsession with secrecy began long before Radagon ascended to the throne in Leyndell. During his time in Liurnia, he took extreme measures to conceal his nature. The mask of confidence, worn by the magic preceptors of the Carian court, tells its own story. When Radagon married Renala, he ordered the Carian magic preceptors to don these masks to make it clear that all of their matters were to be kept strictly private. One must ask why such a decree was necessary. These preceptors were not common servants. They were astrologers and tutors, close advisors to the royal family. They would have been in the constant company of Radagon and Renala. This recurring theme of a hidden truth suggests the masks served a purpose far greater than concealing statecraft. They were meant to obscure a fundamental reality the preceptors might have witnessed, the impossible truth of Radagon's being. Finally, consider the conclusion of the Liurnian War. Muriel's account states that Radagon soon repented his territorial aggressions there and became husband to the Carian queen. By what right does a general, even a great one, make such a monumental decision? The authority to declare an end to a war, to repent for the actions of an entire kingdom, and to forge an alliance between two great houses belongs to a sovereign, not a soldier. Radagon's actions only make sense if he was acting with the absolute authority of the Golden Order's throne, for he was the other self of the queen who sat upon it. To grasp the enigma of Queen Marika, one must first look to her origins, for before she was a god, she was a Numen. The Numen's rune tells us as much. The Numen are said to have come from outside the lands between, and are in fact of the same stock as Queen Marika herself. The Numen are a people the records say very little about. They came from outside the lands between, which already sets them apart from every other race that calls this world home. Their origins are foreign, their nature only partially understood. In addition to this heritage, she was also an Imperian, a being chosen as a candidate to ascend to full godhood. The remembrance of her shadow, Maliketh, confirms this status plainly. Maliketh was a shadow-bound beast given to his Imperian. Marika was therefore a being of immense potential, a Numen with a divine destiny. Some have suggested that the Numen may be descendants of supernatural beings from another world entirely, which would mean the rules that govern ordinary humanity may not apply to them in the same way. From this, a theory has grown. If the Numen are beings of unusual origin and unusual nature, perhaps carrying two selves within one existence is simply part of what they are. Perhaps Marika's duality is not a special condition, but a common one among her people. This theory attempts to explain some of the race's peculiarities, such as their extended lifespans and infrequent reproduction. Perhaps their forms, containing both male and female aspects, made them more complete and less reliant on procreation. This line of thinking, however, crumbles under scrutiny. It is an intriguing idea, but it is supported by no other evidence. Nowhere in the surviving records is another Numen described as possessing such a dual nature. The Black Knife assassins, for instance, were all said to be Numen women, with no mention of any such duality. The duality of Marika and Radagon is not treated anywhere in the record as something ordinary or expected. It is treated as a secret, a hidden thing. The sculptor who glimpsed it was shaken by it. The perceptors who may have known were masked and silenced. Muriel speaks of it as a mystery that endured for an age. If every Numen carried a second self as a matter of course, none of this would make sense. A queen's people would recognize the nature of their own kind. It would not be a skeleton in a closet. It would be an unremarkable fact of her bloodline, noted and moved past. Whatever the Numen are, Marika's duality appears to belong to her alone, or at least to her Imperian nature, rather than to her people as a whole. The most undeniable proof of their indivisible nature is etched upon the Queen's own broken form. The great cracks that run through her stone like flesh are a perfect mirror of the sundered Great Rune. When Marika proclaimed her intent to break the Golden Order, her words were not a metaphor. She spoke to her other half, saying, "Let us be shattered, both, mine other self." The breaking of the ring was the breaking of her body, for they were, and are, one and the same. She does not merely carry the Elden Ring. In a way that defies mortal understanding, she is the Elden Ring. This same baffling truth was discovered through scholarly means by the pensive Gold Mask. He sought to understand the pure logic of the Golden Order, to create a perfect calculus of its principles. Yet, his calculations produced a contradiction. His disciple, Brother Corhin, noted the master's struggle.
While still a precise calculus, the rhythms grew increasingly wild until he simply ceased. Now the master is facing quite the puzzle. The Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god. However, the name of Marika's second husband, King Consort Radagon, also appeared. Who exactly was Radagon?
A man who had dedicated himself to understanding the Elden Ring through pure reason, who had pushed his calculations further than perhaps anyone alive, was brought to a halt by a single name. Not by a contradiction in theology or a flaw in doctrine, but by the appearance of Radagon within the formula of the ring itself. And what his calculations ultimately revealed was this.
To think that Radagon was Marika herself, or at least such is all I can interpret from the rhythm and calculus of his finger. How would such a thing even have been possible, I wonder? Sadly, I cannot comprehend it myself.
The source of this revelation is as important as the revelation itself. Gold Mask did not uncover a historical secret by reading a lost text. He deciphered a fundamental truth from the very structure and rhythm of the Elden Ring's power. It suggests the duality of Marika and Radagon is not merely a biographical fact or a political secret. It may be something written into the ring itself, a condition of what it means to bear it, to be one with it. This is speculation, and it should be held as such. The Elden Ring is not something our minds can fully parse, but it is a striking detail that the answer to who Radagon was did not come from a historian or a confessor. It came from a calculation of the ring, and that points towards something larger. Marika and Radagon, taken together, are a being that sits outside what ordinary understanding can hold. What else could carry the Elden Ring within their body? What else could be so thoroughly bound to it that their very nature is inscribed in its formula? They are not simply a god with a secret. They are something that the language available to the lands between is not quite built to describe. Of the two, Marika is the original. That much can be said with reasonable confidence. What little is known of her before godhood, her Numen origins, her Imperian nature, her life before she ever stood at the gate of divinity, belongs to her alone. Radagon has none of that. He arrives without a before. And in the language of alchemical allegory, this distinction carries meaning. Marika is the substance, the base material, the flesh and blood from which everything else proceeds. Radagon, by this reading, is the active element, something that arose within that substance and took on its own role, its own character, its own purpose in the guardianship of the Elden Ring. He was not there first, but once present, he was inseparable from what she was. A second self created to fulfill a specific role in their shared guardianship of the Elden Ring. With the question of his nature examined as thoroughly as the record allows, it is time to turn to what Radagon actually did. His deeds, his decisions, the shape he left on the lands between. As the active element of the divine Rebis, Radagon was the one who moved through the world in ways Marika could not, or would not. And the first great stage on which he moved was Liurnia. The history that is known of Radagon begins with war. As the active, martial aspect of the divine will, it was in this capacity that he led the great host of Leyndell into Liurnia with the aim of bringing the Carian royal family and their lunar faith to heel. But the campaign did not end in the simple conquest he was sent to achieve. The reasons for the war's abrupt turn toward peace remain a subject of debate, though Muriel's account suggests two powerful motivations were at play. The first was a newfound respect. The Carian knights and their sorceries offered a resistance so fierce that even the champions of the Erdtree could not achieve a decisive victory. Radagon, a warrior above all else, must have come to admire the strength and skill of the very people he was meant to subjugate. The second is simply that he fell in love with Rennala. Muriel's account leaves little ambiguity on this point. Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Rennala. This was not a calculated gesture performed for political effect. The language of repentance and sworn love points toward something genuine, something that moved him beyond the logic of conquest. There is, however, a third lens through which to view Radagon's actions in Liurnia, one that sees his choices as being driven less by personal sentiment of love or respect, and more by an unwavering devotion to the fundamental doctrine of the Golden Order itself. Radagon, as we will see, is of the Golden Order, through and through, perhaps even more so than Marika herself. His very nature could be a manifestation of its core principles. And the Golden Order, as its history shows plainly, that its true strength came not from eradication, but from assimilation. Its method was to absorb and incorporate rival faiths and powers, turning former enemies into pillars of its own ever-expanding structure. One need only look to the heart of Leyndell to see this principle in action. After the monumental war against the ancient dragons, a conflict that could have ended in their utter annihilation, Godwyn the Golden chose a path of reconciliation. He befriended the formidable dragon Fortisax, and from this friendship, the dragon cult was born. This was not a sign of weakness, but of strategic genius. The dragons were not destroyed. Their power was folded into the city's own worship, their might now serving to protect the Erdtree they once opposed. Radagon, standing before the Carian royal house after 2 wars that had produced no clear winner, may have been following the same instinct. Not mercy or respect or love. Viewed from this perspective, Radagon's actions in Liurnia could appear less like a sudden change of heart and more like a masterful execution of established Golden Order policy. He faced the Carians, and recognizing their unbreakable will and potent lunar sorceries, understood that they would be more valuable as allies than as vanquished subjects. His marriage to Renala was therefore not simply an end to a war. It was the absorption of the Carian dynasty into the Golden Order's sphere, neutralizing a threat and gaining a new source of power in a single stroke. This policy of assimilation, however, had its absolute limits. Some powers were too dangerous to be brought into the fold, for their very existence was antithetical to the Order's reign. The fire giants commanded such a power. Theirs was the fell flame, the one force in existence that could burn the Erdtree to its roots. This was not a rival ideology to be subsumed, but an existential threat that promised annihilation. Faced with such a danger, Queen Marika could take no chances. The giants commanded a flame that could reach the Erdtree itself. There was no absorbing that. There was only ending it. And yet, for all the cold necessity of a political marriage, it would be unfair to let that cast Radagon entirely in a hard light. Because when one looks at how he left Renala, hints of love, or at least care, may surface. He left, that much is true, and Renala's grief afterwards speaks to how deeply that departure cut. But the manner of his leaving carries something in it that pure political calculation alone would not produce. He left her the amber egg, a fragment of the Elden Ring itself, the most significant gift within his power to give. And he left her his red wolf. That detail is easy to pass over, but small gestures of that kind tend to say more than grand ones. A man who felt nothing for the woman he was leaving does not think about what she will have after he is gone. He does not leave behind a companion for her protection, something living, something that would remain beside her when he no longer could. Radagon may not have arrived at love immediately. The marriage began as a political settlement, a peace forged from a war neither side could win outright. But somewhere in the years that followed, something changed. The care was real. It showed in what he chose to leave behind when the time came, in the quiet attention of someone who, even in departing, was still thinking about the person he was leaving. This union offered Radagon more than just a wife and an end to a fruitless war. It provided him with an unprecedented opportunity to grow. He was a being driven by a desire for wholeness, a pursuit of perfection that defined his existence. An inscription on an icon made in his image captures this core ambition. As the husband of Renala of Caria, the red-haired Radagon studied sorcery, and as the husband of Queen Marika, he studied incantations. Thus did the hero aspire to be complete. During his time as consort to the Carian queen, Radagon immersed himself in the magical arts he had once fought against. He became a student of the stars and the primeval current, seeking to master the intellectual sorceries of the moon to complement the faith-driven incantations of the Erdtree. This period was a crucial step in his journey to become a truly complete being, a master of both of the great powers that define the world. Of everything that came from Radagon's time with Renala, perhaps nothing shaped the future of the lands between more than the children they produced together. Rykard, Radon, Ranni, three figures who would each, in their own way, become forces that bent the course of history. And if Radagon was already a divine aspect at the time of their birth, then the sheer scale of power each of them carried becomes less surprising. They were not simply the children of a champion and a queen. They were something closer to the children of a god. The records do not preserve much of what passed between Radagon and these children during the years of the marriage. That part of the story is largely silent, though the chronicles say little of Radagon's direct relationship with his Carian children. The adoration of his sons is a matter of public record. They did not simply acknowledge their father. They celebrated him, weaving his identity into their own. General Radon, though a great admirer of the first Elden Lord, Godfrey, was immensely proud of his paternal heritage. His helm, fashioned in the image of a lion, was adorned with a great crimson plume. An inscription clarifies the symbolism. The red plume is a symbol of Radon's pedigree as Lord Radagon's son, the mane of the proud red lion. With this, Radon masterfully combined the symbols of the two men he admired most, the lion of Godfrey and the iconic red mane of Radagon. This reverence was not limited to Radon. The knights of his brother, Rykard, also honored this lineage, suggesting a deep-seated respect for their father's name. This devotion was more than simple filial piety. It was a source of power and legitimacy. By holding fast to the prestige of their sire, the sons elevated their own standing, a crucial advantage when the shattering later forced every demigod to press their claim for the throne. This legacy speaks volumes about the man who created it. Radagon's time in Liurnia was the crucible in which his own distinct identity was forged. He arrived as a champion of gold, a living weapon of the Erdtree, but he left as something far more complex. His personal ambitions are laid bare by the inscription on the Radagon icon. The hero aspired to be complete. This single phrase is the key to his character. It confirms that Radagon possessed his own will, his own desires, separate from those of Marika. Though they shared a soul and body, their minds were their own. His pursuit of completeness, studying sorcery to complement his faith, was the first step on a path that would see his interpretation of the Golden Order diverge from the Queen's. This period of learning and personal growth sowed the first seeds of their eventual fundamental disagreement, setting the stage for the conflict that would tear the world apart. The impact of Radagon's time as the Carian consort cannot be properly measured by political treaties or bloodlines alone. Its true significance lies in the profound transformation of the world's spiritual and intellectual landscape. The prevailing doctrine of the present age, the school of thought known as Golden Order Fundamentalism, did not spring from the Erdtree fully formed. It is a rigid, exacting philosophy, and its chief architect was none other than Radagon himself. The foundations for this unyielding dogma were laid not in the gilded chapels of Lanedell, but in the moonlit halls of the Carian royal manor. His time as Renala's consort was far more than a political arrangement. It was an intellectual pilgrimage. He arrived as a champion of pure faith, but he became a scholar of pure reason. Within Radagon's singular mind, the unwavering belief of the Golden Order met the cool, analytical logic of sorcery. This unique fusion of two traditionally opposed disciplines gave him the tools to re-examine the tenets of his own faith, to structure them, and to give them an unbending, almost mathematical certainty. Therefore, the importance of his marriage to the Carian queen extends far beyond the children they produced or the peace it secured. That union reshaped the very way the Golden Order perceived itself, planting the seeds of the doctrine that would come to define the final days of a fractured world. To understand the rise of the second Elden Lord, one must first look back to the very beginning of the Erdtree's dominion, to an age now lost to memory. The great epochs of this world can be traced through the evolution of its faith, marked by the changing symbols etched onto sacred incantations. By studying these signs, scholars have organized the long history of the Erdtree into three distinct periods. The earliest of these was the age of the ancient Erdtree, a time that encompassed both the primordial vitality of the crucible and a period of effortless abundance known as the Age of Plenty. This was an era when the Erdtree was not merely an object of worship, but a living, breathing source of life. A memory of this time, preserved within the blessed dew talisman, speaks of this lost grace. It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith. The incantations from this first era, such as the blessing of the Erdtree, all share a sigil depicting the tree in its wild, natural form. The description of that blessing laments the passing of this age. The Erdtree once flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment. Such is the course of all life. This was a time of natural bounty, when grace was given freely. Following this was the age of Erdtree worship, when its physical blessings waned, and it became a more distant symbol of belief. Finally, there came the current era, the age of Golden Order fundamentalism. It was during the transition between these ages that the world found itself in a time of need. The age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, had reached its natural end. He was a man of pure conflict, and the age of pure conquest had passed. The challenges facing the realm were no longer armies of giants or dragons, but the creeping shadow of uncertainty that came with the end of the Age of Plenty. A warrior king, however mighty, has no weapon against a crisis of faith. The problem now was not one that bled when you cut it. The Erdtree's abundance was fading. The age of free-flowing grace was closing. The world no longer required a king whose only tool was the axe. The vacuum of power demanded not a conqueror, but a craftsman of belief. A thinker capable of forging a new, unshakable ideology to shore up the foundations of a waning age. This was the purpose for which Radagon was uniquely suited. His time among the Carians had given him something rare: a deep familiarity with both the traditions of faith and the traditions of reason, with incantation and sorcery, with devotion and discipline. That perfect synthesis of faith and reason were precisely the tools needed to fill the spiritual void left by the Erdtree's fading bounty. The two halves of the one God must have recognized this with perfect clarity. A new kind of lord was needed for a new kind of era. And so, the scholar champion was recalled from Liurnia to the Erdtree capital. He returned as a consort to his queen, as the architect of the coming age, ready to take his place as the second Elden Lord. The union of Marika and Radagon, God wed to other self, produced two children. The children born of this singular, two-souled God were themselves a study in duality. The twins, Mikilla and Melania, were each afflicted with a terrible curse from the moment of their birth. One was cursed with eternal youth, the other with an unstoppable, rotting plague. Yet for each affliction, they were blessed with a compensating greatness that set them far above all others. Mikilla was gifted with an intellect so formidable it could charm gods, while Melania possessed a martial skill so perfect she was never once defeated in battle. In these two children, the nature of their divine parent seemed to split. One can see the inheritance clearly. Mikilla, possessed of his mother's sharp intellect and gentle bearing. Melania, who carried her father's red hair and his peerless strength in battle. It is a great irony that the union of a being who strove for completeness would result in children so tragically divided. Perhaps, had these two souls been born into a single body instead of two, they would not have been cursed at all. They might have been the one perfect God, the flawless heir that their two in one parent could never be. Of everything Radagon left behind, nothing outlasted him more completely than his relationship with the Golden Order. It was his great work, his consuming concern, the thing he returned to again and again throughout his life with a devotion that, as will become clear, eventually pulled him into direct tension with Marika herself. But before his role in it can be understood, a distinction needs to be drawn. One that is easy to overlook. The Golden Order as a ruling body, and Golden Order fundamentalism as a school of thought are not the same thing. They share a name and they share a history, but they are different in nature and different in what they represent. The Golden Order itself was not Radagon's invention. It came into being when death was confined, when the rune of death was removed from the Elden Ring, following the destruction unleashed by the Gloam-Eyed Queen and her godskin apostles. The godskin apostle outfit speaks to this sequence of events, placing the confinement of the rune of death after the godskin apostasy. Marika, having witnessed what destined death could do when turned against the world, removed it. What remained was the Golden Order, a new configuration of the Elden Ring, a ruling structure built around that absence. And as a ruling structure, it was always somewhat flexible. It absorbed contradictions when it needed to. It folded in practices that did not perfectly align with its own principles when doing so served the Order's expansion. It was an instrument of governance as much as it was a statement of belief. What Radagon built was something harder and more precise than that. Fundamentalism, in any tradition, is the impulse to strip away the accommodations and the compromises and return to what the doctrine actually says, read plainly and held without exception. It is a refusal of flexibility in favor of purity. And that is exactly what Golden Order fundamentalism represents. Not the broad, adaptable ruling order, but a strict and literal interpretation of what the Golden Order's principles demand, followed without softening and without exception. That is Radagon's legacy. Not the Order itself, but the sharpest and most uncompromising version of what it could be. The arenas are one of the clearest signs of this. Places built for combat and blood sport, raised in Godfrey's era, for a man who only ever celebrated war. Godfrey was always one step away from becoming a barbaric slaughter machine, a warrior who could not exist without conflict to justify him. But Radagon was a different kind of being entirely. His world was built on reason, on order, on the careful elevation of faith and thought. Places like the arenas had no honest place in what he was building. The ritual shield talisman marks their end plainly. A talisman patterned after shields used in ritual combat, held to honor the Erdtree. The practice had died out by the age of King Consort Radagon. The arenas fell silent, and with them, a whole way of life. The arenas were one example among many. What Radagon built was, in a way, a synthesis. He took the intellectual discipline he had absorbed from the Carians, their rigorous, studied approach to understanding power and the world, and he pressed it together with the faith of the Erdtree. The result was fundamentalism, a tradition that did not ask its followers to simply believe, but to understand what they believed, to hold it with precision, and defend it with reason. This mattered because the Erdtree could no longer do the work it once had. The hints are scattered across the record, fragments here and there that point towards something the history books do not state plainly. The Erdtree had burned before. The age of free-flowing abundance had not simply faded quietly. It had been interrupted. And in the absence of a tree that gave freely, the faithful needed something else to hold on to. The Erdtree became an object of faith precisely because it could no longer simply be an object of experience. Radagon's fundamentalism was the answer to that problem. A doctrine strong enough to stand where the tree's direct presence had once stood, built to last even when the grace stopped flowing. This is why Radagon's iconic pose carries the name it does. Golden Order totality. The balance of faith and reason held together in a single image. It is not a pose of war or of submission. It is a pose of completeness, of two things brought into alignment, which is, in the end, exactly what he spent his life reaching toward. The age he presided over looked nothing like Godfrey's. Where Godfrey's era had been raw and combative, shaped by the crucible, and by the necessity of conquest, Radagon's was one of refinement. The culture of Leyndell grew more ordered, more considered, more deliberate in what it celebrated and what it set aside. Radagon's era was defined, in a broader sense, by the deliberate refinement of everything that had come before it. The Crucible, that earliest period of the Erdtree's history, carried within it a rawness that sat poorly with the world Radagon was building. Its incantations, its imagery, its connection to a time when life was abundant and untamed and not yet pressed into doctrine. All of it came to be viewed through a particular lens. Crude, barbaric, a remnant of something the lands between had moved past. The Crucible was not forgotten, but it was looked down upon, treated as evidence of an earlier, lesser stage of civilization, rather than as something worth preserving. This attitude was not incidental. It followed directly from what Radagon valued. A world shaped by scholarship, by reason, by careful and deliberate faith, had little patience for the primal qualities of the age that preceded it. The Crucible represented exactly what fundamentalism was designed to replace. And so, in Radagon's Leyndell, anything carrying the mark of that older era was either quietly closed, set aside, or reframed as something the civilized world had thankfully grown beyond. And by speaking of the Crucible, we arrive at an interesting reading of events. Godfrey's age ending makes sense on its own terms. The wars were done, the lands between had been brought to heel, and a man built entirely for conflict had little left to offer a world that no longer needed conquering. That much is straightforward. But if you think about it, there was no tactical necessity for banishing him along with his host of tarnished warriors. Furthermore, Godfrey being tarnished and sent away is one thing. His Crucible knights going with him is another. There was nothing that strictly required their removal alongside him. They were warriors of considerable power, loyal to the throne, capable of serving whatever came next. And yet, they were sent out all the same, which raises a quiet question. Whose decision was that, truly? One is left to wonder if Radagon himself, in his obsession with order and perfection, was the driving force behind this exile. And indeed, if Radagon was already fully present as Marika's other self by this point, then the authority to tarnish Godfrey and clear out his warriors was as much his as hers. One could argue that the barbaric representation of Godfrey and the chaotic, primordial aspects of the crucible were simply too much for Radagon to stomach. And since Radagon is Marika, his will could have become her decree. The crucible knights represented, in what they carried in their very existence, the raw and primal quality of the crucible age, the old ways that Radagon was actively working to move beyond. It is not difficult to imagine that their continued presence in Leyndell was something he found deeply uncomfortable. They were a living reminder of everything his era was meant to replace. Barbaric by the standards he was setting, out of place in the civilized, ordered world he was building. With this, we begin to glimpse the darker side of Radagon, as his obsession with perfection becomes impossible to ignore. In his pursuit of order, he begins to erase any ideology other than his own. And yet, for all of Radagon's efforts to forge a world of high culture and unbending reason, the age that followed was far more chaotic than the one he had replaced. The primal barbarism of Godfrey's time was straightforward. It could be met and conquered on a field of battle. But the new chaos was a far more insidious thing, for it bloomed like a poison flower from within the heart of his own family, a direct mockery of his obsession with perfection. The world he had so meticulously crafted began to fracture, and the fault lines ran directly through his children. His daughter Ranni, an Imperian chosen by the Fingers, initiated a dark conspiracy to cast aside her divine flesh, murdering her own spirit to escape the destiny the Golden Order had laid for her. His son Rykard, consumed by a venomous hatred for the very principles of order his father championed, descended into the most profound blasphemy, allowing himself to be devoured by a god-defiling serpent. Even the children born of his divine union, the twins meant to be the paragons of the new age, became symbols of the Order's failure. The brilliant Makilla, seeing that the Golden Order held no cure for his or his sister's afflictions, abandoned it entirely, seeking salvation outside of its gilded cage. And Melania, the peerless warrior, was a living testament to imperfection, her body and sight slowly consumed by an incurable rot that no amount of faith or logic could mend. Even the son who bore his name with the greatest pride, the mighty General Radon, chose a path of spiritual defiance. While fiercely proud of his red-maned inheritance, Radon gave his true reverence not to the scholar his father had become, but to the warrior he had displaced. His idol was Godfrey, the banished First Lord, and he devoted himself entirely to the art of war, a pursuit his father had deemed uncivilized. To a man whose entire existence was a quest for completeness. This cascade of heresy and decay was a living nightmare. Every principle he held dear was being violated by his own kin. To compound this failure, the two fingers began to search for a new line of Imperians, a clear sign that even the divine powers had lost faith in his fractured dynasty. This unrelenting collapse of his ideal world appears to have forged a harder, darker edge to Radagon's character. Faced with a reality that would not bend to his perfect reason, his obsession with order became fanatical. The scholar and philosopher began to recede, replaced by a merciless enforcer, a zealot who would try to mend the cracks in his world through any means necessary, however brutal they might be. Yet, the final catastrophe that would bring everything apart was still to happen. The irony of fate would only deepen into a darker, more cruel and sick joke, for his own other self would ultimately turn against him. The greatest catastrophe was yet to unfold, born not from any external enemy, but from within the very heart of the divine vessel, from within his own soul and flesh for Marika. The final, unbearable catalyst was the murder of her son, Godwyn the Golden. Marika, driven to the brink by the unbearable grief of her son's murder, would rise against the Golden Order. She would lose faith in everything she was meant to embody and protect, for that very order had failed to preserve her child from destined death. Queen Marika turned against the greater will, against her own divinity, and against her other self. And in an act of horrific transgression, she shattered the Elden Ring. One can scarcely fathom the state of Radagon's mind in this moment. The paragon of order, the man obsessed with a perfect, reasoned world, was now trapped within a body committing the supreme act of chaos. The rebellion was not at his gates. It was in his own soul, wielded by the hands he shared. His own other self, the being he shared a soul and a body with, turning against the very thing he had given everything to preserve. The Golden Order, his life's work, his answer to an age of waning faith, undone in a single act of grief and rage by the one person in all of existence he could not be separated from. And yet, through the shattering, through the chaos that followed, through the suffering it brought down on his own family, he did not waver in what he believed. He would spend whatever time remained trying to repair what Marika had broken. This is the moment that gives true venom to Marika's words. When she called him the leal hound of the Golden Order, it was the ultimate condemnation. Even as their children fell to madness, heresy, and despair, even as the Order failed in its most fundamental promise, Radagon's loyalty never wavered from the system. He remained Radagon of the Golden Order, a dog faithful to a master that had overseen the corruption of their house. Faced with the choice between his rigid ideals and the raw grief of his other half, he chose the ideals. The ultimate transgression for Marika was the breaking of the ring. For Radagon, the ultimate transgression was that she had lost faith. Elden Ring shattered, Radagon lost everything he had been reaching toward. The chance to become a true god, to press his will into the shape of the world and hold it there, was gone. He was shattered alongside Marika and the ring, three things that had been one, all broken at the same moment. And Marika was punished for what she had done, sealed inside the Erdtree, imprisoned within the very thing she had once presided over as its queen. But the catastrophe did not end there. It only changed its shape. The shattering followed. Every demigod, every warlord, every power that had been held in check by the authority of the Elden Ring and the throne behind it, all of it came loose at once. The lands between collapsed into a war of a scale not seen since Godfrey's age, except this time there was no single cause, no unified direction. Each faction fought for its own vision of what should come next. Some wanted the Elden Ring for themselves, to become the god that Marika had failed to be. Others wanted the order dissolved entirely, remade from the ground up, consumed by something older and more absolute, as the followers of the frenzied flame sought to do. Radagon was a man of deep ambition. That must be said plainly. Watching his children sink into every form of corruption imaginable brought him grief, and the agony of seeing what had become of his sons and daughters was real. But grief was not the only thing burning in him. There was rage as well, a rage fed by ego, and Radagon had ego enough to fill an age. He was a half-god on the path to becoming the god, the one whose order would have made another shattering impossible, whose will would have bent the lands between into permanent shape. To have that taken from him, to be betrayed by his own other self at the very moment the prize was within reach, was something he could only have experienced as a kind of blasphemy. In his full power, no war would have dared rise. No demigod would have had the room to reach for the ring. He would have made the world kneel, and it would have stayed kneeling. Instead, he is now nothing more than a fractured vessel carrying a broken ring, stripped of his ascension, watching the world tear itself apart below him. And yet he did not let go. With what power remained to him, he sealed the Erdtree. The mark on that seal is his, and it could belong to no one else. It was a final act of order from a being who had lost almost everything. A refusal to allow any of those demigods, those warlords, those grasping fragments of a shattered age, to lay hands on what remained of the ring. He would rather hold the world in permanent stasis than see it claimed by someone unworthy. Even a broken order held in place is still an order. And so the lands between froze. Nothing moved. Nothing grew. The cycle of return to the Erdtree continued without end, the same loop repeating for however long it took, which was longer than anyone could measure. That was Radagon's final answer. Not victory, not the godhood he had sought, just a locked door and a land held into a perfect stalemate. The world became a land of echoes, a place of endless cycles where nothing truly began and nothing could ever end. But Marika had one move left, one that Radagon could never never have anticipated, because it came from a direction no reasonable mind would have thought to guard against. She would not call upon a demigod or a noble warlord to break the deadlock. She would reach beyond the great houses and the fields of battle. She would call back a no one, a tarnished of no renown, to return to the lands between with nothing but grace and will. Their purpose would be to defy his perfect stasis, to slay all who stood in their way, to gather the shattered runes, to burn the Erdtree if that is what it took, and at the end of all of it, to face Radagon himself, the leal hound of the Golden Order. And this is what makes Radagon's final stand worth understanding properly. Because he is not simply a guardian blocking a door. His reasons for fighting the tarnished run deeper than duty, and they reveal everything about who he was. Why would Radagon, the ultimate champion of the Golden Order, stand as the final barrier against a tarnished who might mend the Elden Ring and restore the very system he cherished? The answer is a complex one, rooted in both his unbending ideology and a cold, pragmatic fear. The first reason is one already touched upon. One must understand that Radagon did not merely follow the Golden Order. He codified it, refined it into an exacting science. Radagon had arrived at a conclusion he held without compromise. He was the only one fit to rule. To an outside eye that may read as the pride of a broken man clinging to what he once had. But from inside his own understanding, it was a principled position. He had spent his existence studying the deepest laws of the Golden Order. The law of causality, which holds that all things are linked in a chain of relation. The law of regression, which speaks to the pull of meaning, the eternal yearning of all things to converge. He had built principles from these laws, a complete and considered way of living under the Golden Order. From his perspective, his version of the Order was the only correct version. Anything less precise, less reasoned, less complete than what he had constructed was, to his mind, simply a descent into uncivilized barbarism, wearing a crown. Beyond this ideological purity, there is a second, more pragmatic reason for his hostility. The tarnished, having cut through every power in the lands between, arriving at the foot of the Erdtree, represents something genuinely uncertain. There is a real possibility that this intruder could amend the Elden Ring, could restore some form of order. And that possibility, rather than comforting Radagon, is precisely what makes the tarnished dangerous to him. The Golden Order, in general, despises and fears one thing above all else: vision. Visionaries are the most dangerous force in the lands between. For a person of vision, a mind with its own direction, its own picture of what the world should become, is the one thing capable of leaving a permanent mark, of bending the age towards something new. And the tarnished, whoever they were, whatever path had brought them to this point, had almost certainly been touched by vision along the way. An unknown quantity who has journeyed through a broken land and conversed with its heretics. Perhaps by Shabriri and the Three Fingers, who wanted no order at all, only the unifying flame of frenzy. Perhaps by Rani, who had dedicated everything to dismantling the very foundations the Golden Order rested on. Perhaps by something else entirely. The Tarnished carried within them the accumulated influence of a shattered age, and there was no guarantee, none at all, that what they intended to do with the Elden Ring bore any resemblance to what Radagon had spent his existence building. So he fights, not only from ego, though the ego is there, not only from duty, though the duty is real. He fights because the Tarnished is an unknown quantity standing at the threshold of the most consequential decision the lands between has ever faced. And Radagon cannot afford to trust an unknown quantity with the Elden Ring. And even should a Tarnished defeat the zealous Guardian, this does not grant them victory. For this is why, after Radagon falls, the Elden Beast emerges. The beast is not a being of ideology or ambition. It is the living embodiment of the Golden Order itself, the will of a distant power given form. It is the ultimate protector of the ring, a final failsafe beyond any one person's will. Radagon fights to protect his version of order. The Elden Beast fights to protect order. And for that, to truly claim the ring, to truly decide what the next age will be, the Tarnished must prove themselves worthy not just of defeating a broken god, but of facing the ring itself. In the end, Radagon was a man of ambition, a man of order, and a man of love, whatever shape that love took, and however much it cost him. He remains one of the most singular figures in the entire history of the lands between. No single figure has left a deeper mark on the recent age, yet the man himself remains a void in the chronicles. He appears in the historical record fully formed, a king without a kingdom of origin, a hero without a past. From this nothingness becomes the hand that shaped more of the world than almost anyone else who ever walked it. He sired children whose individual histories could fill libraries. He waged wars that redrew the map of the world and ended them on his own terms. He grasped the nature of the Elden Ring with the cold mind of a scholar, not the blind faith of a worshipper. And yet, the most striking thing about him is how little he left behind in his own voice. There is barely a word attributed to him directly. For a figure of such reach, such consequence, such undeniable presence in the history of the lands between, he speaks almost not at all, as if he passed through the age as a force rather than a person, leaving his mark on everything while revealing almost nothing of himself. His entire life is questions, and at some point, a person must accept that some of those questions, particularly the ones surrounding what he truly was with Marika, their state was a divine paradox, exist beyond what any mind can fully hold, a figure of immense influence, preserved in almost no records of his own making. And yet, he was there, behind every doctrine, every war, every sealed door, and shuttered arena and golden principle. He was there, perhaps from the very beginning, moving through the shadow of Marika's throne, pulling the age toward the order he believed the world deserved. A long pilgrimage toward the creation of his perfect, absolute order. This was the story of Radagon, the champion who became a scholar, the scholar who became a lord, and the lord who stood at the threshold of becoming a god, the god who was never crowned. This was the story of Radagon of the Golden Order,